Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Canadian Story. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're joined by MP Raquel Dancho. Mrs. Dancho, welcome to The Canadian Story. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So if you could, for those of the people who haven't been on Instagram or who have been living under a rock, could you detail out who you are, what your background is, what you're doing in Ottawa, and what's your story?
Yeah, so I'm the Member of Parliament for Kildonan and St. Paul, which is sort of the northern suburbs of Winnipeg. I was first elected in 2019. The riding I represent was Conservative for about 10 years, and then we lost it in 2015 during the Trudeau wave, so to speak. And the MP for the Liberal MP for this area became a cabinet minister, and ultimately I defeated her by 8,000 votes. So that was pretty great. And it's been a long ride. I've worked provincially as a political staffer in the Manitoba Legislative Building with the PCs here. And before that, I worked at sort of a libertarian think tank for a little while. And prior to that, I studied political science at McGill University. But ultimately, I came from 4 generations of farmers in rural Manitoba. So my Canadian patriotism and my roots run really deep, and that's where my conservatism comes from, the hard work and the sacrifice and the lack of opportunities and the lack of even like the size of government being so small. Like people really had to rely on themselves, their families, their church, and their community. And they really helped create the incredible country that we live in. So I do think a lot of the millennial generation is rightfully criticized for feeling very entitled to an easy life, very entitled to all these big spend government programs and government really carrying them from cradle to grave. But that's just not how I was raised. It's not the stories that I was raised with. It's not the values that we have. I deeply value freedom and the incredible country we live in, and just prosperity and opportunity to be an entrepreneur outside of government sort of interference. So that's kind of my philosophical background and that origin story there, but not from a political family, didn't have sort of an uncle I can call up to get me a job in politics or help find donors for a campaign. I really had to start everything on my own and establish sort of a foundation to build on, and ultimately became an MP for the Conservatives at 29.
I remember when you were running in the provincial election. I believe it was 2016 in Manitoba. Yeah. I was staying on Phil Giuanu's couch because I was running Bob Legasse's campaign, and was out of Landmark, or whatever it was, Landmark, I think it was. The office was there, so I was staying on his couch. And I remember you were doing good TV hits there, and now you're an MP. You're a shadow cabinet minister. So talk a little bit about, because I think a lot of the Canadian Story listeners like politics and like kind of the insider. Like, what was it like, the origin story? And one of the things I always tell Zach is politics is an oral tradition, right? It's all about the stories that staffers are told. Like back in the Reform days, it didn't matter that the CPC was there when I was in Ottawa. You were still either a reformer or a PC. People still thought that way because it was an oral tradition. Now that's past, right? We're all the Conservative Party of Canada now because the new generation has come in. So maybe like share a little bit of your political pedigree, like who brought you in, who mentored you, who got you to where you are today?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, well, in terms of, if I can even go back a little further, some of my conservatism comes from, again, if you're looking at rural Canada and you're looking at the history of the electoral successes of various parties there, I mean, the NDP really started well in Saskatchewan, but really thrived in rural prairie provinces for many, many, many years. It was the party of the working man, the farmer, the cooperative. That's, even my family in the heyday of the NDP being farmers, that was their party. I mean, Edward Schreier was from my hometown. My high school. Yeah. Edward Schreier, my high school is named after him. And he was certainly an inspiration to me, despite that I don't share his political views. He's actually a constituent now. Fun fact, does not vote for me. Has the biggest NDP sign possible, but that's okay. And so looking at that lens sort of is important. My dad was in a union. My husband is currently in a union as well. But we are strongly, strongly conservative. And if you look at sort of when the PC party was in, and Brian Mulroney was an incredible prime minister, incredible conservative prime minister, but he was winning like seats. Like I believe when I looked in downtown Toronto, like Bill Morneau's seat was Brian Mulroney's conservative party at the time. So there wasn't sort of a connection between those sort of elite conservatives and rural Manitobans, which where my family's from. But now if you look, conservatism just absolutely crushes rural Canada, at least in the West and most of Ontario. And we should be owning all of rural Canada with where we're coming from on our freedom values and the like. So I think that certainly plays in. I'm not like an elite conservative, so to speak. I'm more of like a community grassroots, pro-freedom, pro-West, pro-resource development, get guys to work and build this country kind of conservative. But given my sort of that I went to McGill, I've lived in a metropolitan place. I have been influenced, of course, by the urbanism in Canada, the business aspect of conservatism as well. My parents are also small business owners, so I think I think my makeup in the background is a good mix of conservatism and Canadian Western history. So anyway, but on your question, I think it was overall about how did I kind of get involved provincially, or just
like who are the people who? So, for example, one of my big mentors was Patrick Rogers, right? He was issues management at the Prime Minister's office, and then he was my director of policy. And David MacArthur was another one. He was my kind of mentor as the chief of staff for a while. People like that who kind of brought you in and taught you the trade, because you're obviously a very skilled politician, organizer. You beat a sitting cabinet minister by 8,000 votes, so you're an organizer as well. Politics, for a lot of people, they don't understand how that operates. But I think it's important for people to know your connection to the people, but also who taught you your craft. Yeah.
Because a couple of things, I guess. So I could speak about my mentors and I'll get to that. But I actually started public speaking in the church. I skipped out on a few of my confirmation classes, and as punishment, the pastor said I had to get up in front of the whole congregation and share with them what I had missed, what I should have learned. So excellent lesson. And I ended up really loving it. And I became quite a natural at it. So it's a natural talent that I've honed into a skill. I also have, I would say, a very strong work ethic. So when it comes to door knocking or working a room at a fundraiser, or like if I put my mind to it, like it's just like a freight train. Like no one's going to stop me. So that helps as well. And just sort of the competitiveness of not really looking at my opponents of who's beside me or behind me, but just really focusing on where I know I can go if I put my mind to it. So that helps a lot as well, because you have to have sort of you have to have a real fire to deal with this kind of criticism and pressure and public pressure and lack of privacy. So that helps. But I met a woman, her name is Bonnie Mitchelson. She was elected for 30 years as an MLA provincially for the Conservatives. She was a cabinet minister. She helped revolutionize the way provincial governments deal with immigration, with the provincial nominee programs. And she's just an incredible woman. And she represented an area is really one of my core conservative areas in my riding. And I met her working at the legislative building and earned her respect and her friendship. And she really took me under her wing when I decided to run in her area federally. And she had since retired. And she really just wanted to see this area stay conservative, wanted to see more women in the party. And she just had an amazing reputation. I think some of our politicians are really, maybe they're great and they're very effective, but maybe they don't have the best community representation, or they're maybe a little too cutthroat or not compassionate enough for their actual voters. But this woman, you go door knocking anywhere in my community, and she is loved and respected by people from all political stripes. And she's extremely humble as well. You'll never hear her brag about herself. Another thing you don't often hear from politicians, who are very boastful and full of themselves a lot, I'll say. But not this woman. And yet she's so accomplished. So anyway, that's probably my major political influence that I've had. Yeah.
I like that. So who's your main political influence?
My main political influence. I would venture to say that I'm not really influenced by any politician over another politician. So I sometimes, I mean, I don't know how much you know about the podcast, but we are a fairly political podcast, and I sometimes ask myself how the heck I'm sitting here, because I'm not. At least before COVID happened, I was certainly not a very political person. My background is in the music industry. I work in the music industry. I tour with bands. I do sound. I own a recording studio. So I wouldn't say that I am deeply influenced by a particular political figure, although I'm now deeply concerned and interested in politics in our country. So that's how I would answer that question. But what I wanted to ask something. You said you grew up in a fairly where you grew up, there wasn't a huge government to kind of like carry you forward, right? You had to rely on your family, on your community, on your church. You said, I'm a Southern Ontario boy, regretfully, frankly, because I feel like the way I view the ideals I have for our country are not, I don't share those ideals with the people around me very much. David likes to brag that I belong in Alberta. But what was it like? So what was that experience growing up in a smaller community in a more rural place where there wasn't as much political influence? What was that like? And what did you learn from that? And then how did you actually get a start in, like, what made you decide to go into politics, especially in a place where there wasn't a whole lot of political influence?
That's a great question. I guess for me, being in a small town, and if you've grown up in a small town, you'll know this, but you become a very friendly person. You become a very open person because there's only so many people, and everybody knows everyone. Everyone knows each other's business. It's not like a big city where you can be a total asshole to someone, and it doesn't matter because you'll probably never see them again. In a small town, you see someone in the ditch, like you pull over the truck and you help them out of the ditch, because they're probably your cousin or your friend or your parent's friend. You see someone on the street, you say, good morning, how are you doing? You help each other out because that's how, particularly farming communities, if there's been terrible circumstances where a farmer has died at the peak of harvest, well, all the farmers in the community will come out and sort of save the day for that family who's lost their patriarch and their main source of income. That's just a regular story in every small Western town. And so I think that part of that, I think that's why I tend to be very approachable. I love talking to people. I'm easy to talk to. I've been told that I'm very down to earth. And I think that is solely because I've grown up in a small, humble, small country town. And I'm very grateful for that. It also, and you touched on this from what I said, but it builds a lot of resilience. Like there's not if you wanted to go to a hospital with an emergency room, like it is far. I've actually met urbanites like I could never live that far from a hospital, which is never something I'd even thought of. What do you mean? You just never go outside the greater Toronto area because you're too afraid of hurting yourself? It's just crazy to me. And my dad's a farmer and a handyman. And so you'd look at, if something breaks, things break on the farm every single day. It's just part of the life. But to drive to the specialty hardware store is an hour and a half. So you often have to make the best of just what's right in front of you. And so from that, you see so much sort of outside the box thinking, whereas government is the exact opposite. It's like, this is the checklist. There's nothing practical about it. No one who's ever actually had to deal with those regulations has written them. It's just someone academically who said this is how this construction regulation is going to work, but they've never built anything in their life. And as my dad used to say, they probably couldn't tell the difference between a screwdriver and a hammer. So I think that sort of outside the box thinking, that resilience to figure it out just with what you have in front of you, also helps me when it comes to public policy. Not from an academic family, but I have a solid education. And when I look at any policy critically, I think my strength would be, how is this applicable practically? And that is a critical piece that's missing from so much government policy, and why we see everything so slow. Like take passport offices and airports, like you name it, the Liberals have really screwed it up. And I think that's from a lack of people that actually have to deal with these processes every day. And then the last thing you asked, where did this all come from? I was a bit of an odd kid, I think, but my parents and grandparents would talk at the table, like most parents, of taxes and government and the issues of the day. And it was sort of a hot summer day on the farm. And I remember it very well. I was about 8 or 9 and I could barely see over the table. And they were talking about this, they might have named Gretchen, but it was like this government in Ottawa, and this was the 90s, that had done this thing on farmers that they really didn't like. And they were upset about it. And I just remember feeling the injustice of this big bad government really picking on my humble, hardworking family, and just resolved in this 9-year-old brain I had to go and do something about it in this Ottawa place. And then exactly 20 years later, I did get elected and went to Ottawa to do something about it. So I think the drive is just really fighting for everyday people whose lives just are wrongfully impacted by government overreach and bad regulation and policy. That's probably my core driver.
That's cool. That's cool. I like that. Okay, so I want to kind of pivot here and ask you. There's been a lot of buzz, and you've been fighting quite hard over this whole ordeal with the mass shooting from, I can't remember how many years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and how the Liberal government is potentially trying to use that as a way to make policy and push policy forward, and how that might be inappropriate. So I think it's a really important story. Can you kind of outline what's going on and then talk about why it's important?
Yeah. So, we all remember when the pandemic hit in March, and then the world shut down and everyone's lives were upturned and job losses and family crises. It was just an unbelievably bad time. And just in the heat of that, there was the worst mass shooting in Canadian history in Nova Scotia. So it was just like, bam, world shuts down, bam, 22 people plus, including a pregnant woman, are murdered by some psychopath in Nova Scotia. And what we found out in the last 5 months is that what would seem, and what our opinion is of the evidence we've read, and there's very strong evidence to support our position, that the Liberal government saw the deaths of 22 Canadians as an opportunity to use as leverage to further their gun control agenda. So pretty disgusting and appalling things. And this wasn't like months after. This was like in the heat of it. People they weren't even really sure how many people had died, been murdered at this point. People hadn't even had funerals yet. Bodies weren't even in the ground. Families couldn't even properly grieve. And the Liberal government, in partnership, in cahoots, so to speak, with the commissioner of the RCMP, were looking to leverage this for their own gain. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we found out. I can go into more details of the evidence and what we've been doing to hold them accountable and the roadblocks we've encountered. But it's we know where they stand on gun control. They don't seem to care at all about the real issue, which is criminal elements in our urban cities that are smuggling guns across the US border. They don't care about licensing. They don't care about following the law. Not a single piece of federal Liberal legislation on gun control will do anything to impact the growing rate of gun violence in this country as a result. And yet they repeatedly go after licensed, trained, and vetted firearm owners in Canada and use it as a bludgeon to really divide Canadians at election time over guns, which is something we should all be able to come together on, reducing gun violence. So there's a lot of political elements to this, and it's really sad because it's about it, at the center of it, people died and they used it to their advantage, if I could use that word, which is a horrible way to look at it, but that's apparently from what we've seen, how they approached it.
Yeah. Okay. So a few things there. First, though,
Yeah.
I think we can all agree. I think we want less gun violence on our streets.
Totally.
The problem is, and I think conservatives want that. I think liberals want that. I think the NDP want that. You are more plugged into obviously the political network in Ottawa than most people because you're there constantly. You're an MP, you're in the House, you're doing your job. From my perspective, if we all want the same thing, which is less gun violence, right? If we can agree on that, the Liberals must know that it's not a legal gun owner problem, because they must at least sometimes look at statistics around it. They must know that it is a gun smuggling problem and it is primarily a gang violence problem. So why, from your perspective, being closer to these people on the Liberal side than I am, why is it that they've put their metaphorical crosshairs on legal gun owners as opposed to investing more money in border protection or policing in city centers or whatever those options might be to reduce gun violence?
Yeah, so a couple things. Well, I think everything really comes down to two things. The first thing is, like I said, I think they know it's a political winner for them, the way that they frame it. They've been very successful. We have not been able to make our case strong enough and win over the mainstream media to our position historically enough to show Canadians that our arguments are very valid, that what we would do would actually reduce gun violence. We are the tough on crime party. We will make the streets safer. We will clean up the crime that's increasing in our cities, which is historically true of conservative governments. We are better at cleaning up the streets and reducing crime than Liberals. Liberals are traditionally and ideologically softer on criminals than they are, on law-abiding firearms owners, which is who they attack. But so I think it's a political winner for them, or it has been. We're going to change that, working very hard on that, and have had a couple wins. But I think at a philosophical level, they just don't believe in firearm ownership. If I could say, this is just speculation, but just looking at the spectrum on the left, they just do not want Canadians to have firearms. And I think
why do you think that is? Like, why?
I think we could go into a broader issue of like the left and what their goals are. I think you can bring in a lot of American arguments for this and the American arguments that they make for firearms ownership. Canada has a different history with firearms. Our best case to be made for firearms ownership is it is a deep part of our cultural history. We haven't fought in a civil war. There's no sort of militia element and protection like the Second Amendment in the US. So it's a bit of a different world in Canada. And the American style isn't something that I've advocated for. It's not part of our policies. It's not something we're interested in. What I am interested in is protecting Canadian culture and history. And if I just went through my background, this kind of fits in perfectly to that. As a rural Canadian, I grew up hunting with my dad. It's been in our family for over 100 years. It's part of how we sustain ourselves. It's part of how we bond with our parents. It's part of our culture. Whenever someone gets a big buck, a big deer, you go over to that farmer's house and you have a couple of drinks and you celebrate this bountiful harvest. It's similar in Indigenous communities, though they've been doing it for far longer on Canadian soil than we have. And we have also an old history of sport shooting. My family's not sport shooters. We're not gun collectors. We use them as tools. But we've competed in the Olympics with sports shooting for 100 years. So these are things that are part and parcel to the Canadian identity. Maybe not the Toronto and like Laurentian elite identity. They very much look down their noses at us and what we do with firearms. So I think it's maybe sort of a paternalistic approach. We know better than you rednecks and your guns. Like, we'll keep you safe and take those from you. That's, I think, what part of it is. And that's why it gets me so fired up. And we own firearms, but I'm not an enthusiast, I'm not a sports shooter, but I fight very hard to protect this part of Canadian culture that I think deserves respect and to be welcomed as part of the Canadian identity and everyday discourse.
Right. That makes sense to me. Okay. So can you outline, going back to kind of what's getting hashed out in the House, can you outline what is being alleged that the Liberal government did in regards to the RCMP and this shooting, and how they're using it for the purpose of pushing forward their gun ban agenda?
Yeah. So you'll remember that. So this terrible shooting happens within weeks. It was like May 1st, again, like pandemic shooting, then May 1st happens. May 1st, they brought out their OIC, where they banned 1,500 models of what they've called and yet to define military assault style weapons, which is just a kind of a souped up rifle, basically, various rifles. And so they just unilaterally banned this. They had this power because of Bill C-71, which passed a number of years prior. And this is when they decided to pull the trigger. Cloak of darkness, pandemic hits, everyone's looking another way. This terrible shooting happens. People are upset. They ban, just outright ban. You can't even open this. You can't use it. You can't touch this piece of property you own anymore. 1,500 different styles of firearms, models of firearms. Huge impact on the firearms community in Canada, and really no democratic oversight at all. So that happens. And then we find out this 2 years later, almost to the day, we find out a couple pages are released during the Mass Casualty Commission, which was launched to investigate the shortcomings of the police sort of government response to the Nova Scotia, which I won't go into here. 4 pages of notes came out from the superintendent of Nova Scotia that just sort of blew all of this up, where Superintendent Darren Campbell of Nova Scotia was saying, Brenda Lucky, our RCMP commissioner, was reprimanding them in this supposed heated meeting for not sharing the models of the weapons used and seized by this evil killer that killed 22 people. That she was pressuring them, reprimanding them, saying you should have shared these. The Liberal government wants to pass gun control agenda. This will help them. I'm under pressure from the PMO and from Minister Blair, then Public Safety Minister. And it just blew up from there. Because from his notes, it was clear that our RCMP commissioner, who's supposed to be independent, was interfering in a criminal investigation to further the Liberal political agenda of gun control, and that she was being heavily pressured and therefore reprimanding her deputies for not doing her bidding on releasing the weapons info. Then we started to find out more things where she herself, just days prior, again, the shooting happens, this is all happening within 2 weeks. Like, it just is right away. This isn't months after when the criminal investigation started wrapping up. This is right in the heat of when it's starting. She emails the Prime Minister and the Minister's office, or the staff, saying, do not share this list beyond the Prime Minister and the Minister. There's an ongoing investigation that relates to that. Like, it could jeopardize the investigation. Don't share the weapons info that you've asked for that I'm giving to you. Okay, so we have it in writing. That's her position. That's also the position of the Nova Scotia deputy, saying, look, we can't release all this gun info. They're all smuggled. Most of them are smuggled in from the US. We're working with the FBI. This just happened. We can't start just blurting out all the information. We're trying to get to the bottom of who helped him smuggle these into Canada, which ultimately killed many people. Then just 3 or 4 days after she sends this warning email, we later got an audio recording of her reprimanding her deputies for not sharing that info, which she just said not to share. And audio recording, which came out just about a month ago, corroborated all the notes from Darren Campbell, all the testimony from the Nova Scotia deputies, that they said she was just really almost bullying them, that they did not do this, even though she was of the professional opinion it shouldn't be done. So I hope I made that clear. There's so many moving elements and parts. I could speak for about 2 hours about this, but ultimately there is audio recording of the commissioner connecting the release of weapons info to the pressure she was getting from the Liberal government to do so that they could use it as leverage to pass a gun control policy. And
this is bad. And this is bad because this is a third-party organization that should have nothing to do with government and political interference. It should be completely separated. Yes, let's talk about that for a second. It's egregious because it's mixing police and politics, and that is not democracy.
Oh, exactly. Sorry, I always think that goes without saying, but I know the media needed a lot of convincing to understand that this was a serious problem. So you have a criminal investigation going on. The Nova Scotia is leading it. They're saying we need to keep some of these details very close because we're trying to catch the bad guys with it, and to say it very bluntly. And then the RCMP commissioner reaches way down into Nova Scotia, calls this meeting with them, and basically yells at them for not sharing this information publicly, when she herself was of the opinion days prior that they shouldn't. So that's politically an issue because you have a criminal investigation trying to hold those accountable for the deaths of 22 people. Meanwhile, the Liberal government isn't thinking about the deaths of people. It's thinking, oh, great, people died. Again, this is me paraphrasing, or this is me being very crass about what I believe they did. But they looked at all these deaths. Now is our time to pull the trigger and ban guns. Who cares about details of a criminal investigation? Let's get that gun information out now. And that builds our argument for banning these guns, basically unilaterally without democratic oversight. So that's why it's appalling. You can't just reach into a criminal investigation and play politics with the details for your own selfish benefit. And the fact that they used the RCMP commissioner and that she was, and I'll say it's so weak that she couldn't stand up to that kind of political pressure. We've seen issues with her like this throughout her entire term, is very appalling to us. And that's why we asked the minister at the time, Bill Blair, to resign. And that's why we've asked for the RCMP commissioner to resign as well. Canadians shouldn't be standing for this kind of like gross, crass politicking during the deaths of people. I mean, there's a time if you want to ban guns, fine, but let's do it democratically, and for God's sake, let people be buried and mourn before you're starting to take advantage of this tragedy and ban firearms under the cloak of a pandemic darkness. It's sick to me. So anyway, I tend to go off about it, but I feel pretty fired up about what they did.
Well, it's almost as if it's going to sound harsh, but it's almost as if 22 Canadians died and the response of the Liberal Party was to salivate at the mouth at the idea of being able to ban guns. Like it is the exact wrong response to that sort of event happening. So what's happening now then? What do you hope to accomplish? You talked about a couple of people resigning. What are the goals? Where is this trying to be pushed to? And what kind of outcomes are you looking for?
Well, we do believe a resignation would send a very clear message that at least that we won't stand for this. Like, we'd like to see enough pressure put it on the commissioner and the minister that they resign in disgrace for what they did or what we believe they did. Again, they've categorically denied this. When we've had the minister and commissioner at committee twice, we've read them evidence and they, in essence, say that's not what I said. I'm like, no, this is what's in the audio recording. Well, that's not what I meant. Oh, that's out of context. Oh, that's just a misunderstanding. Well, no, I was just talking about the guns and the gun legislation for context, is what she says. So we've just sort of repeatedly got this like slippery politicking, so to speak, from them that's allowed them really to, I mean, the media just kind of plays their clips where they deny it. And we've done really what we felt we can do. But it's really been a trickle of evidence coming out, notes, testimony, audio recording over 5 months. So we'll see what comes up next. It's not really done until it's done. So maybe there's something more coming. We don't know. But for the time being, we've taken as far as we can. But we'll certainly keep the pressure on because we believe very strongly that they should resign. But what's interesting is that now the media is sort of getting a little bit of a taste of what we've had with Commissioner Luckey in all of this. If you're following the Emergencies Act inquiry at all, there recently was released evidence or text between the RCMP commissioner and the OPP commissioner, the Ontario Police Commissioner, in which she's texting him asking what seems a retroactive letter of support from the OPP saying, yes, please invoke the Emergencies Act, in essence, after it's been invoked. She's reaching out to him being like, oh, has the minister reached out to you for a letter of support? There's text messages of this, like pretty shocking, shady stuff. And there's text messages of her twice saying to him, let's use a different, or I'm paraphrasing, let's use a different app that permanently deletes messages. It doesn't store them anywhere. She's twice saying that to the OPP commissioner. We have two commissioners of our head of law and order during the invocation of the most powerful law in the land saying, let's use an app that allows us to delete evidence about our support for this. It's pretty concerning. And so when the reporters asked her about this, she's like, oh, no, that's not what the text says. They're like, yeah, this is what the text says. And then she just kind of walks away. They're like, well, did you ask him for a letter of support? She's like, no, I didn't. I'm like, well, this text says it. And no, so this is what we've been dealing with for 5 months. This is what we've, the sky is blue. She says it's green. And that's her response. So it's pretty disappointing.
Did they ever get a letter of support from the OPP? I mean, like we're already like glossing over the fact that the request came after the actual invocation of the act, but was that letter ever provided?
I don't know. It's a good question. I should know that. Sorry that I don't. But what I do know is that no level of police governance ever asked for the emergency powers, despite the Prime Minister on several occasions, and the Minister of Public Safety at the time, who's currently the Minister, Marco Mendicino, said it several times at committee and in the House. Oh, we did this because the police asked for it. But that we know that is a lie. That did not happen. So again, just more lies that we're seeing. It all kind of fits together really well. You see, they seem to have been very desperate to kind of get their ducks in a row to try to make the case that they needed to stomp all over charter rights using the emergency powers. So I think that it's making them look pretty bad, and it's making the commissioner look pretty bad, and is exactly the behavior we've seen from her and the Liberals for months. So I think it's becoming pretty clear.
I don't understand how they can get away with all these lies.
No.
I don't. Like, why are Canadians allowing them? Oh, it drives me nuts.
Well, if I can be so bold as to say, it has something to do with the fact that media is state funded, right? Because you can get away with lies when you control public opinion. You can control public opinion by choosing what stories they hear. So I think that's an issue that needs to be hashed out.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, we talk about sort of the media bias that we see. Again, I'll say a couple of things on the media, because I know it's a really big trigger thing. I think the largest cheers a conservative will get in crowds is like, defund the CBC. So certainly recognizing that. And I have my own very, very real frustrations with the bias I see. I think it's a couple things. I think just journalists are usually urbanites that live in the East or just live in our major cities. They have a different worldview than, a rural conservative like me, for example, though there are things we can find common ground on. That's what I try to do. But I think that they're just ideologically, this, they're just more liberal left leaning. They just are. So of course, that's how they see the world and what they care about. They care much more about social issues than they do talking about the impacts of deficit spending. That's why we see that. They're also getting a lot of funding, as you've said, just in the latest economic update. Chrystia Freeland's getting $42 million more dollars to the CBC. What do they need 42? Didn't they give, I just read, they gave $150 million of bonuses and pay raises in the last couple of years, $150 million during a pandemic when most of them were working from home. Like, what's going on? So I think it's just their general values, and definitely it's an incentive perhaps for the funding. It just doesn't seem very fair, especially when our rural newspapers and our other publications and those, looking to come from the conservative side, True North, Post Millennial, others that aren't getting a penny of support. So it's pretty frustrating. But I will say I do have respect for journalists. I do talk to journalists. I'm not a conservative who shuns them. And if you are one, that's totally fine too. But I try to do my best to speak to them as much as I can, and be as honest as I can. But I've only been doing this for 3 years, so come ask me in 5 years.
Maybe you just haven't learned your lesson.
Play this back to me as I avoid media in 5 years. We'll see.
Stephen Harper used to not avoid media too, but then the days they have a way. I mean, we've had journalists on this show. I'm a big fan of journalists, big fan of the Western Standard, that kind of thing. But I do wonder a lot about what has happened to the ideological capture of our journalists. Generally speaking, the mainstream media seems to be almost a religion at this point. I don't know. They won't even talk about things that aren't acceptable. It's very weird. I don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, honestly. Like, if you look at the US, they have a bit more balance. I mean, they have an entire network, the Fox News network, right? And several other ones that are popping up that are conservative, on the right, whatever. Like, why don't we have the same thing? We have the National Post, which is a very respectable, moderate, sort of right of center publication. But, they're not, I wouldn't say that they parrot liberal talking points quite like or conservative talking points like some of them, CBC, sometimes verbatim. It's just like, oh, this is the news release. This must be exactly what the liberals have done. And they denied it, so it must not be true. And we're just going to go look the other way now. I don't know. I'm not sure.
It is fascinating.
Go ahead.
I don't know. I don't know what to make of the media. I also wonder why. So if you look at the States, the States has Fox News, right? And Fox News is a massive network. And it's not like there isn't right of center media outlets in Canada trying, but for whatever reason, there just hasn't yet been the same amount of traction that Fox News has gotten. And I wonder about that, because I don't speculate that anyone is intentionally trying to suppress those outlets just for the purpose of ensuring that they don't succeed. Perhaps just the temperature of what people want to consume isn't that. I don't know. I do have a different question though, if I can kind of skip a beat here. I want to go back to the Emergencies Act, because from the perspective of me, who I'm just a citizen, that is the scariest thing in my lifetime I've seen happen in our country. And the freezing of bank accounts, and there was, okay, you have to stay home. And then in Ontario, there was, okay, you have to stay home. And this is the fourth time we're telling you that, this is our fourth lockdown. And that was ridiculous and unnerving and weird. But it pales in comparison to the Emergencies Act and freezing of bank accounts and that sort of thing. So from my perspective as a citizen, that is I don't even know what to make of that. And I think it's fast. It's funny how fast we move past things, because it wasn't that long ago that happened. And yet the country already feels like, in many ways, like that's a piece of history that we're just kind of moving on from now. But I don't want to gloss over that. So my question is, someone who's plugged into Ottawa, what is the temperature around the Emergencies Act amongst your colleagues? Is it something that's still being thought about lots? I know that there's the inquiry, I believe I'm using the right terminology, going on, but like, what is the temperature and feeling of the people you work with around what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're following. I think everyone in Ottawa, particularly the journalists, I will say, are following the inquiry very closely. It's sort of the chatter, I think, probably of every water cooler of every journalist office. They're very, very interested. I too am interested, but I mean, we know what our position is, and it seems to be that the evidence that's coming out is also reinforcing that the justification for invoking these extraordinary powers that stomped all over charter rights was not, that threshold was not met, and therefore what they did to people was, I guess, illegal. I suppose it was a confidence vote. People forget, but the Trudeau Liberals made the vote on the invocation of the act a confidence vote. So if it failed, there would have been an election. Government would have fallen. So the NDP voted with them, and the Bloc and the Conservatives voted against it. So I share your concern about the amount of power that the Liberals exercised using that Emergencies Act to freeze bank accounts without any due process, no oversight, just on a whim, was very scary. And I think it had a massive impact on, like, millions of Canadians donated like $50 to the convoy. The amount of frantic calls and emails we were getting of people saying they're canceling their credit cards, they're withdrawing thousands of dollars, or then real people who had their bank accounts frozen who couldn't pay their mortgage. Like, real impacts. Who didn't do anything wrong. They just made maybe a big donation to what they believed in. And in their words, what gave them hope for the first time in almost 2 years, because of lockdowns and mandates and all these other things that they had grievances with. So I found the whole experience pretty traumatizing. Like the pandemic, I say this all the time, but if anyone was surprised that the convoy happened, they weren't really paying attention. Those are MPs who were not talking to those suicidal calls that I got, that weren't talking to widowed senior women that were locked in their tiny apartments for months on end, to children who didn't want to eat food anymore because they were so depressed they couldn't go to school, to the hundreds of thousands of businesses, particularly in the hospitality sector, that obviously closed because they had no revenue for years. This was really, really bad. And I think we're seeing the spike in crime and addiction and homelessness. I don't know if you guys have been out in your urban cities, but I've never seen it this bad in the 32 years I've been alive. We're seeing inflation. I mean, we can go on and on of all the serious impacts this has had on society. And when we were in the heat of it, anyway, I wasn't surprised at all that it happened, not to justify any illegal behavior. Shouldn't be blocking roads, but I wasn't surprised. So the fact that they came out with this massive nuclear option and didn't give anybody any dignity, I think is very concerning. And what are they going to do the next time there's a protest they don't like? Is this just going to be what we see now? And last thing I'll say is I try to think of, like, if we read another country's government doing this to people, what would we think? Government for 2 years locks people in their homes, forces them to take medical decisions against pain of losing their job and being able to travel. And so massive protests ensues. Actually, technically wasn't that massive, but it was in the downtown streets of Ottawa. And then the government to squash this democratic protest, this act of civil disobedience, freezes bank accounts and eliminates the right to peacefully gather, which is part of our charter rights. Like, what would we say? Would we say, well, they should have just followed the rules and shame on them? And what would be your reaction to that?
I would say you're talking about Venezuela, right? Like, that's supposed to happen somewhere else.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like that's supposed to happen in Canada.
Crazy, right? Yeah. I know people, if it was a fringe minority, or I wouldn't say fringe, but it was a minority of people that were on the other side of the mainstream COVID policies. I recognize that. And people didn't like them, and they were the loud person at the dinner table whining about mandates, in the words of those who were on the mainstream side. And they hated the convoy. Like, I get it, but I mean, protests are disruptive by nature. We had a massive protest that blocked railways for 21 days.
I don't know more.
I don't know more. Like some of the
Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, well, and if you go back into Winnipeg history, like the general strike helped usher in the labor movement in Canada. It was very disruptive. I believe someone died in that protest. Like protests are disruptive, and they are often against very legitimate concerns that those protesters have. So, is this what we're going to do? And I mean, we've talked a lot about in our caucus how like where was this applied when Elizabeth May was blocking pipeline construction, and where there's hell being raised on pipeline sites where construction workers building our pipeline infrastructure are being attacked by insane eco-fascists with axes and homemade bombs. Like where is the outrage for all the other destructive protests we've seen? You know, like I living in Montreal and working at the Manitoba legislature, I've walked through so many protests where people camp out for months, like just camp out right in front of the office building with cookout and sleeping bags and God knows what else. And sometimes they're very mean and vicious and messy, not all the time. As far as protests go, I've never seen protesters sweeping the streets and cooking for homeless people and having bouncy castles and kids running around having fun with face paint. Like I've never seen a protest like that. Not that it justifies their legal behavior, but this was like nothing I've ever seen. So anyway.
So
were you in Ottawa during the protests?
Yeah, I lived there. I lived there like a third of the time, 40% of the time. So I walk by it all the time. And one of the arguments that the public safety minister has made is that it was so unsafe, right? Because if it's a national security concern, of national impact, of public safety, that meets the threshold, invoke the act. But I mean, all of Ottawa's MPs, journalists, the prime minister of the country, I mean, he doesn't walk to work, but he drives through it. I walked through this thing every single day for 3 weeks. There was and we have Zoom capabilities. We didn't have to go to Ottawa. If it was so dangerous, we could have been told to stay at home in our ridings. The minister read a committee a few months ago, or back when this was all happening, he said, there was threats of rape. Straight up called him out on it because I was like, you let me walk through this every day when I was under threat of rape? Really? Like you can't just say those claims and then have done nothing about it and then brought out this sledgehammer and have no evidence except for hearsay to back up your claims. Like I just found that all very offensive. We all walk through that thing every day. Not to say some people weren't intimidated, but I mean, I grew up with guys with like lifted trucks and like, I wasn't intimidated. Those are the kind of guys you call when there's a creepy guy at the party or when you hit the ditch in the winter. Like I saw it differently, but I could understand that maybe some people did find it intimidating, but that doesn't mean it was a national security concern.
Right. So what would happen? What would happen if it was found that the threshold for invoking the act was not met? What would happen then?
That's a really good question that we've been having, or I've been having some discussions about that. Like, what do we do then? I mean, again, I mentioned this was a confidence vote. So shouldn't there be an election then or something? I mean, he staked his government's confidence on the indication of it. So if it was found that this was wrong, wouldn't the natural thing be that he has to go to an election? Not to say I want that, not to say that that's our position. This is just me. Like, I have the same question. What are the consequences for wrongfully invoking this act?
There's no precedent.
Yeah, like Justice Rouleau says, yeah, Trudeau, you just shattered charter rights with no justification. That's my ruling. What happens? I don't know. Like, I guess it's just like, I'm going to guess that the media's and the general public's going to be like, well, I don't really care about that. It didn't affect me. I didn't like that convoy or all those anti-mandate people. So no big deal. I think that that's probably going to be the general reaction. And then we're all just going to move on. Maybe. I hope I'm wrong, but based on just the reactions of people, just like regular people and people that aren't plugged into politics, I'm going to guess that's what's going to happen. But if he had any integrity at all, I mean, he should face serious consequences for doing this. I mean, or is this the charter just this kind of like flimsy piece of paper that we just pretend we care about, but don't actually care about? I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's a question we need to ask ourselves as Canadians. Like, what does that actually mean to us? Do we value what it says? Does it have purpose in our lives, or does it not? Because that's really, I guess, kind of the question that we're riding on right now. Is that piece of paper worth anything? I mean, I have my own feelings about it, but I mean,
I don't think it's worth anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to get sucked into semantics and like, oh, so-and-so couldn't get to work, or so-and-so couldn't get to doctor's appointment, therefore the Emergencies Act was needed. I'm not saying those things weren't terrible for those people, but it doesn't mean the justification was meant to freeze people's bank accounts without due process, to eliminate the freedom of assembly, just like this, when there was no real threat to public safety, if it's found that is the case. Like, I don't know. I think that this would mark, I could be wrong, and I'm not an academic or a philosopher, but perhaps this would mark a pivotal time in Canadian history. And we look back on 100 years and maybe we don't have the same rights that we do today. And we can point to this circumstance as what sort of started that, maybe that slippery slope. That's kind of how I perhaps would couch my fear. That's how I'd frame it. Like, if this is okay, what's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years? And are we going to become a country that doesn't really care about freedom, which apparently is a dirty word now? Like, if you look at the mainstream, it's like, those freedom lovers. I'm like, how terrible a thing. Like, what do you mean freedom lovers? Like, isn't that what we send thousands of young men?
We literally sing about it all. The true north, strong and free. I don't know.
It's like freedom.
We live in a clown world.
Freedom, but yeah, like tens of thousands of 18-year-old men went to be slaughtered in Europe so we can be free. And now we're like, ooh, you guys are just a bunch of whiners. Like, what? I don't know. How quickly we forget, eh? I don't know.
Yeah. I went, a number of years ago, I was on tour with a band in Europe, and I got to go to Vimy Ridge on the topic of men being slaughtered in Europe. I cried like a little baby. I could not, I had no idea it was coming. I could not believe the feeling, and I don't have anyone in my family that I remember who has a military background, but I can't even describe to you the feeling of standing on ground in a place. I mean, my geography isn't perfect, but I don't know, 4,000, 5,000 miles away, like more. Like this place that France has awarded to Canada, that is Canadian ground in France, because Canadians stood on that ground and stood for freedom and bled for freedom and died for freedom and didn't come home to Canada for freedom. And now in our country of Canada, we look at freedom as a dirty thing. It just like my blood boils over that sentiment. I don't have words to describe that.
Yeah. No, I got shivers when you were talking. I've never been there, but I would love to go. It'd be such an honor. Remembrance Day is coming up on Friday, and we all pause on Remembrance Day. We wear poppies. We think about this every year. At least if you're a good Canadian, you certainly do. But yeah, I don't know what happened in the last 2 years. Was an interesting. I look forward to seeing like the psychological studies and papers that I hope are written about how we treated each other. Like, I've been door knocking for, I don't know, almost 10 years. And I've door knocked tens of thousands of doors. And in the last election, that was a year ago, that was the most horrible 2 months of my life. Like the vitriol and the anger of neighbor against neighbor on both sides of this. But of course, it was the unvaccinated that were losing their jobs and being ostracized from society. So they would cry. The amount of crying I had from women and grown men on the doorstep saying, don't trust the government for whatever reason. So I'm not trusting them to get this, losing their job, not being able to see their family, not be able to go to funerals or weddings or see the births of grandchildren because they didn't get this shot. It was devastating for them and it's really scary. And then on the other side, we had people just so angry, like foaming at the mouth, people screaming at me that I wasn't pro-vax enough, even though I'm very like pro whatever you want to do. Like, you should have access to it if you want it. Like, it's not really my business. And, like, we can go into that, but it's just, and yet I've never seen that. People asking me about my personal medical history. Like, what, isn't that rude?
It is.
I'm going door to door looking to represent you and you want to know my medical private issues. Like, it was just so violating. I can't explain it any other way. But the people People thought they had the right to ask the rudest questions. And I've never seen that. Anyway, it was just a horrible situation. So, and governments did that to people. Governments and I guess media.
Well, government is almost always the thing that does the worst things to people. It's always government.
Like hindsight 2020, but again, like these are things that were actively done. Trudeau used mandates to divide people on purpose. He said, you have the right not to get vaccinated, but you don't have the right to sit next to someone who is. That was the most powerful man in the country saying that at a Liberal rally. Like, how disgusting. And that's what they did. They made it on vax. Do you believe in vax mandates or not? And they divided the country out. So I think we're still healing from that. So anyway,
we are.
I can go on about this. It was traumatizing as a politician to deal with.
Okay, well, go into that really quickly. It was traumatizing as a politician because of the door knocking and the why aren't you this enough? Why aren't you that enough? Like, why was it traumatizing as a politician? Because I know why it was traumatizing as a citizen, but why was it traumatizing as a politician?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. So I think first, selfishly, there's like the personal impact of feeling like you're being violated every day and yelled at and people are crying and it's just like a disaster. And it was very intimidating and violating on a personal level. But as an elected representative and as a conservative who, as I've outlined today, and we've talked about at length, like who cares about, Canada means freedom. Canada means freedom of choice. Canada means freedom of assembly. Canada means freedom to run a business. Canada means freedom to have people on your private property and to get married and to send your kids to school. Like my whole value system of what I believe as a conservative and what I went to Ottawa to do was just shaken to the core, very scared of what that means for, just dealing with this every day. And then also, there was one opinion you heard every day. And if you had any question of that, you were a denier, like anti-science, or like wanting to kill old people, like the most horrible things just for questioning basic things. So there was a silencing, there was a sort of a terror put on anyone with a different opinion, even just like a moderately different opinion. I'm not talking about folks who think there's microchips in vaccines, just like a moderately like, well, do vaccines really stop you from spreading it? Just like basic things that we know now to be very true, but were called conspiracies at the time. So it was a scary thing for me personally, for the values and why I went to Ottawa. And it was very scary to see economically and mental health wise, thirdly, and most importantly, what was happening to people. Like, again, I mentioned it earlier, but like, this is really devastating and will have generational impacts on Canadians. Like what we did to people, what the governments did to people will have very long-term impacts beyond any sort of long COVID or anything like that. Like I think we're just starting to see, there's a recession coming. If you want to talk about childhood development, stealing 2 years from them and keeping them in front of an iPad for 2 years when they're 6. You talk to any pediatrician, what that's going to do to an entire generation of people long-term in terms of mental health, cognitive capabilities, work ethic, being able to properly socialize with others at that critical time. We can go on and on and on and on and on of the impacts societally that this is going to have. So that's so weighs on my mind. So reliving all the convoy stuff, that all comes back, and that's just on a human level kind of hard to deal with, to be honest. So yeah, it's been tough. How about you guys? Why don't you bare your souls to me and tell me how the pandemic hurt you?
Zach, how's it been for you?
Yeah, pre-pandemic, I didn't consider myself an anxious person whatsoever. But watching everything that you believed was just going to kind of work for you and continue to roll on forward, like, I don't know, being able to work your job and being able to go visit your loved ones and seeing your parents at Christmas and, things that you didn't really think were on the negotiation table, having those like all of a sudden blasted out of your life was an unbelievably unnerving experience. And again, I did not enter the pandemic an anxious person. And at one point, at like one of the lowest points for me, I had like my only ever full-blown panic attack. I was feeling anxious and I I decided I was going to try to like overcome it by working out. And apparently sometimes that can make it worse. I didn't realize that that's a thing, but I heard about that from someone. And like, I was paralyzed on my couch for probably 10 or 15 minutes. Like I just couldn't move. And like, we watched the world fall apart on us. Thankfully, we're still here. Thankfully, we have more and more conversation around everything that happened. And thankfully that conversation is becoming less and less one-sided, because in the middle of it, it was either you were of the orthodoxy that, you know, these are the things that we believe in, or you were an outcast. And that's not supposed to be what Canada is. And it still is incredibly shocking that that's what it became so quickly. And I don't have that sorted out in my brain because, you know, growing up, you know, Canada was this country that believed in immigration and allowing different religions into our culture, and respecting people's differences, and respecting that they come from different backgrounds, and respecting that they have different ideas and ways of living their life. And then all of a sudden, on a dime, that respect was thrown out the window. And that was shocking. And the only thing that I can really say about it is that we did it because we were scared. And we need to remember that, because scary things aren't going to stop happening. I think there's, like you mentioned, a recession. I think there's many scary things that our country is yet to face. And I don't think they're, frankly, that far down the line from where we are right now. There's certainly things left to hash out and answers left to uncover. And that some of that's going to be scary. But we can't lose our cool like we did, because that's kind of what we did. And I have huge amounts of sympathy and huge amounts of space for mistakes, because mistakes happen all of the time. And we were faced with a foe that we had never encountered before, that we didn't understand. And we reacted in a way that was meant to keep people safe. And that is a noble and honorable way to react to such a situation. But we also lost our cool. And I think that's something that our country needs to learn from. I guess that's where I sit on it right now.
No, it's really good perspective. Thank you for that.
I think for me, it kind of broke me in a way. I'd really believed in the system, right? I really believed. I served Harper. I was a political organizer. I got Kenny elected, raised him $200,000. I worked for Ed Fast. I've done this thing, and I always was like, you know, as much as I hate the Liberals, they believe in Canadians, right? They want to do what's best for Canadians, or as much as I don't like the arrogance and the jokes we always make about politicians being, you know, self-centered and, you know, thin-skinned, and they have all these things. They're always fighting and arguing. It was like, at the end of the day, I knew these politicians, I thought. And at the end of the day, I believed they cared about their country. But that is not what we saw. We saw something very strange. I don't understand it. They sorry.
Yeah. No, I think it was a tough one, David. I totally get it. Like, and again, I think, and I'm not the interviewer here, but I'll say this. I think just while you take a minute, but I think it's very obvious that this group of people we just met, all three of us here. I just met you. It's very clear that, and we're educated, hardworking, professional, normal people who pay our taxes and are like, you know, well, I would say I'm right wing, right center, whatever. Like, we're just normal people. We're deeply, we're not vulnerable people. We're not in the vulnerable community. We were deeply impacted and traumatized. And I've shed a few tears myself over the last 2.5 years, more than a few, about how tough this is. So if we're having a hard time,
yeah,
what about the people that were on the verge already?
They're dead. They're killing themselves.
Well, and there's the addictions crisis is insane. It was bad before. Like 8,000 people die of opioid overdoses before. We're right in the midst of this. Now it's insane. I went to Vancouver this summer, and it is unbelievable that is like, that's Canada. Okay. And in Winnipeg, bus shelters are now homeless homes. Like, that was never like that before. We've always had an issue, but it's exploded. And these are real people that were not homeless 2 years ago. They're now drug addicted, lost their homes, probably their families, and can't afford food or even a place to live. So anyway,
and like you said, they're drug addicted, so it's even worse. They're committing crimes to get so they can pay for the only thing they have left, because it's the thing that took everything from them. Right? It's wild. Like, and all of this is happening, and we have the government calling them names, calling these people that are despairing names. And it's not the world I believed we existed in, but I think it's the world we can get back.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I hope so. I mean, there's, I don't know what role politicians play, but certainly our language and our words have meaning. And I've tried to be, I try to be a candid person as best as I can. And you working in politics, David, and you being, certainly a frequent commentator, Zach, it's like, you have to be careful what you say. But I try to be very candid, and I think I could candidly say that I do feel, and I have throughout the pandemic tried to build bridges to bring people together. I did this like crazy speech, which I didn't plan for, about in February of right in the heat of the convoy, that like went insanely viral around the world. We were being contacted by people around the world who identified with the grievances I was sort of connecting and airing. And it was I called it the bridge builder speech, because I was trying to share across the aisle, so to speak, what the other side, my fringe minority, had been dealing with and why this convoy happened. And it was on like Ben Shapiro and like all these it just went nuts. And I had no idea that was going to happen. I went completely off script at the last minute. And I think it was that moment that I'm like, okay, like, it's not just me. It's not just like a bunch of people that just happened to call me in the last 2 years to tell me their horror stories of what's happened to them. This is like a world phenomenon of depression and angst and trauma. And like, what impact is that going to have on the world? Like, the world went through this, and not every government did what our government did to people, but it to some lesser or more degree. I mean, it's still going on in China. If you're looking what they're doing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there's still COVID-0 locking down. If you're in a Costco and there's a COVID outbreak, you're getting locked in a Costco. It's nuts. So I don't have the answer of what that's going to do to people, but I think like long term, but I think it's going to be really bad. So, but I mean, if we look at the history of the world wars, the Great Depression, people bound back. There's baby booms and economic booms and amazing innovation, and like the Zoom revolution. Maybe that is something that is a positive thing, I think, in some ways, particularly for women with children, to come out of this. So that's not a lot of solace for the people that are homeless now.
No, I think you're right. I think any crisis can provide an opportunity. And I think really one of the opportunities is what you said earlier, right? It's that maybe we can actually decide how important that piece of paper that says you have rights is. Zach's describing the Canada that he believed existed, where people could have different religions and different ideas, and we could all live in harmony with one another. And maybe we can actually build that now that we realize, actually, it doesn't really exist yet, but maybe it could.
Yeah, I like to write that down. Maybe that's what we should focus on. I try to focus on the positive. So yeah, this has been a very downer conversation.
Yeah. It's been great. Don't worry, most people won't listen to the end anyway. So only like our really hardcore fans will hear the last 10 minutes.
So I want to be respectful of your time. So we don't need to continue to drag this on. But why don't we end on a positive? Why don't you take a couple moments to talk about what is your hope and vision for the next, maybe, 5, maybe 10 years of Canada. Maybe it's the next 6 months that you're thinking about, but what positivity do you see? Like, what direction can we move forward to that, when I wake up a year from this conversation, we're living in a better Canada? Like, what does that look like to you?
And I love that conversation. I think that's what keeps me motivated, because it's, if you've worked in this industry, it's a tough job, as we've just outlined for an hour. But what keeps me going is like that vision for the country. And I mean, in 5-10 years, like you've said, I would love to see consecutive majority conservative governments who have built a more prosperous, more secure, and a free society, a better life for children, a better life for Indigenous children, a better life, more opportunities and access to what they need for the vulnerable population, a thriving small business community because government's finally taken their foot off their necks with regulation and control, a thriving trade and international investment industry that's just like booming, and our natural resources are flowing, and Canada is just overflowing with cash, so we can create massive generational infrastructure projects across the country and invest in the social safety net that many vulnerable Canadians need.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's the CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.